The aftermath of Hurricane Helene continues to devastate communities, the damage now exposing FEMA assistance gaps in Appalachia. Residents of western North Carolina are feeling the impacts of Helene, with rescue efforts in the region stalled from impassable roads and damaged cellular networks. Floodwaters pushed by remnants of the hurricane have isolated the city of Asheville, and now some residents are taking matters into their own hands. Local restaurants have been dispatching food deliveries in the area, and private citizens have been driving tractors to clear debris. Frustrations are also boiling over the speed of assistance, and calls are growing louder to make the help come faster. The storm dumped over 14 inches of rain over 3 days in western North Carolina, wreaking havoc and causing mudslides and massive devastation. Now there's concern that the destruction in North Carolina will prevent voters from getting to the polls. News Nation's Blake Berman has the latest from the Tar Heel State in our continuing Swing State Spotlight series.
All right, so the damage and destruction that you see there could disrupt the presidential election in the battleground state. North Carolina election officials working to determine the status of its polling places. Roads as well for postal workers that are handing out ballots, delivering them at least. Now, as of right now, early voting is still on track, as of now, to begin October 17th in the Tar Heel State. It is one of a handful of battleground states, 7 really. Now, there's a chance it could go blue for the second time since 1976. And as part of our continuing Swing State Spotlight series tonight, we focus on the Tar Heel State, and joining us live from High Point, North Carolina, that is east of Asheville, is our next star colleague at WGHP. He is the senior reporter, Bob Buckley. Bob, thanks for being with us here on the Hill. So you really have a September surprise and an October surprise. The September surprise started with the Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Let's focus first, though, on that October surprise, because that's going to be the most consequential one. You know, it's a bit of an irony that water's essential for life, but it becomes deadly and destructive when it comes in torrents. Brooke covered well what's going on in the mountains, so I won't get into the physical things that are happening, but I will tell you we still have an election that's going to come off on November 5th. And as you just mentioned, early voting's supposed to start in 2 weeks. I don't see any way that happens in most of these counties up in the mountains. And here's the real ramifications of that. The 14 counties most affected by this storm, you have an island of blue in Asheville, a very progressive city, and a sea of red in all the rural counties around it. Former President Trump won those 14 counties by more than 90,000 votes in 2020. But he only won the state overall by 75,000 votes. So getting all those voters who are now displaced to the polls is going to be massive for the Republicans this November.
And Bob, real quick, because we're seeing Liz Cheney bottom right of our screen, which means Kamala Harris set to speak around the corner. Mark Robinson, how's that shaking up the race?
Well, you know, I've covered politics since Ronald Reagan was president. I've never seen a case where a statewide race could affect a federal race. But Mark Robinson, who had a lot of comments that were pretty inflammatory even before he ran, is now got this new reports out of some things he said that is really turning a lot of voters off, especially the independents. And if enough Republicans simply stay home or don't vote at all in some form, that can be enough when President Trump only won the state by 1.5% last time around. If enough stay home, he could lose it. And if he doesn't win North Carolina, we don't see a path for him to win the presidency. All
right, Bob Buckley in the middle of it all. Bob, thank you.
Thank you to Blake Berman and Bob Buckley. We are a month away from Election Day, and the presidential race continues to be neck and neck. A new Emerson College polling national survey found that 50% of voters said they supported Harris and 48% said they support Trump, with 1% supporting another candidate and 1% saying they were undecided. Our friend Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Emerson College Polling, joins us now to break down the numbers. Matt, thank you so much for being here today. Those numbers show just how tight this race is, and I want to zero in on one voting bloc. It's young voters. It seems like they've gotten a lot of attention, particularly from the Harris campaign this cycle. But historically, they're less likely to turn out compared to other age groups, particularly older voters. So which candidate are young voters favoring? You know, seems to be Harris, but are you seeing a major generational split?
Yeah, you know, young voters have been a little bit of a tough nut to crack this election cycle. We've seen them sort of all over the place, especially when President Biden was still on the ticket. We saw much lower support for him this election cycle than we did in 2020. And now we're seeing a little bit of a reversion. We're seeing sort of what we would expect out of these youngest voters. So when we look at the 18 to 29 demographic specifically, we see Vice President Harris is winning them by about a 2-to-1 margin, so 63% to 36%. That's about what we would expect. It's roughly what President Biden won these voters by in 2020. But then when we go up one age bracket, when we look at that 30 to 39, those voters who are in their 30s, it is more competitive. So they are split 50 to 48 versus Harris versus Trump. So that's not exactly what we would expect. It's a little bit worse than what President Biden managed to do with this demographic in 2020. When we look at favorability, it's interesting. The youngest are much more favorable towards Harris, 42% very favorable versus Trump, only 26%. And we see a little bit of that mirroring of the ballot test for voters in their 30s. 36% had very favorable opinion of Harris versus 31% for Trump. So, overall, when we look at the big picture of voters, say, under 50, we see that Harris is, in the mid 50s, about 55%. I think that that's where I would want to be if I were on her campaign. But there is definitely a bit of a gap between what we saw in 2020 and what we're seeing now.
So I want to move on to the economy, which is continuing to be top of mind for voters this election cycle. We know that it's the #1 issue for 41% of voters. Which candidate are voters looking towards when it comes to the economy? And, what other issues are concerns for each party? It seems in recent polling, Matt, that Kamala Harris has closed the gap with Donald Trump, particularly on the economy.
She has to some degree. The economy remains a top issue. We've seen that throughout this election cycle. And we see that former President Trump is winning those voters who say that the economy is their top issue by about a 2-to-1 margin. We also see that he's winning those who say that immigration is their top priority with 84%. So that's a huge number who choose him. And those are the top two issues in the country. Harris, however, wins on everything else. So that includes crime, threats to democracy, foreign policy, housing affordability, and overwhelmingly on abortion. And then when we look at the partisan breakdown, so across all parties, economy is a top issue. That's lowest for Democrats, highest for Republicans, with independents somewhere in the middle. Threat to democracy, that's number 2 for Democrats. Abortion closely follows. When we look at Republicans, as you might expect, immigration is their number 2 issue. Everything else kind of falls by the wayside. And then with independents, they're very much between the two. So immigration is in second, and then followed closely by threats to democracy. So we do see a little bit of ground that Harris has made up here. But I think that, big picture, looking at all of these issues, I think the real positive in her column is that she's winning on everything but the economy and immigration.
So on Tuesday, we saw Harris's running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, go head-to-head during the CBS News presidential debate that drew in over 43 million voters. The general consensus, Matt, of that debate was that it was very policy-focused and civil, with Walz and Vance even saying they agreed with each other at points. How has the VP debate affected their favorability? It seemed that the pressure was really on for Vance to come across as more relatable and more favorable.
Yeah, and in full disclosure, this poll was fielded at least mostly before the debate. But even so, we've seen some significant movement just from a few months ago when we have tested Walz and Vance, both nationally and in the swing states. And we see that Vance's favorability is improving. It's about what you would expect demographically. Walz does better among younger voters, women, and then voters of color. Whereas Vance, he has improved his standing among women in particular. And he does better with the sort of core conservative groups, men, older voters. But I think that this is all a good reason to believe that Vance has improved his favorability As you said, there was a consensus that this debate was civil, that it was policy focused. And so I think that Vance's favorability only improves from here.
Well, we'll certainly be watching more for the VP debate, VP candidates, I should say, on the campaign trail. Matt Taglia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The swing states of Arizona and Nevada could tip the November election in favor of either candidate, and a key demographic in those states are Hispanic voters. News Nation's Mike Vaquera breaks down which way this critical voting bloc is leaning.
Do Hispanic voters hold the key to the presidency? I'm Mike Vaquera with News Nation in Washington. Both Vice President Harris and former President Trump are reaching out to Hispanic voters on the campaign trail.
Happy Hispanic Heritage Month.
The Hispanic support is off the charts.
The number of Hispanic voters has grown tremendously in recent years. This year, they're expected to number more than 36 million ballots cast. That's up by about 12% from 2020 and up by more than 150% since 2000. Most importantly, in the key swing states of Arizona and Nevada, Hispanics make up more than 20% of all voters. Across the country, Hispanics favor Harris by just more than 53%, according to polls. That's compared to about 42% for Trump. But that is a much smaller advantage than in years past, raising red flags for Democrats. In the last presidential election in 2020, Joe Biden got 65% of the Hispanic vote. I'm Mike Vaquera. This is the News Nation Political Minute.
And thank you to Mike Vaquera for that reporting. Job growth surged in the month of September, adding a whopping 254,000 jobs last month and blowing past expectations. The unemployment rate also ticked down to 4.1%, easing fears of a labor market shutdown. The surge comes after the Fed cut interest rates by 0.5 percentage point last month, a move intended to make sure the Fed keeps the labor market steady. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And be sure to come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.